So the decision I made was to set up a small, in-house, low-cost effort in remote viewing. And that's what we did.
Thompson's remote viewing unit was based at Fort Meade in Maryland, under the Army's Intelligence and Security Command. First housed in these Army intelligence offices, the unit was soon moved to its own, more isolated quarters, where remote viewing sessions could be held with relatively little distraction from other activities at the base. Those admitted to the unit were military intelligence personnel, whose backgrounds suggested that they might have natural psychic talents.
One category of person who was good at remote viewing were imagery interpreters. The good imagery interpreter sometimes can see more in a picture than the unpracticed eye, and they had a knack for visualization that appeared to work very well for remote viewers. Other categories of people who were said to excel at remote viewing were people like artists, entrepreneurs, risk takers. By the nature of the intelligence business, we had some risk takers, too.
Sergeant Mel Riley was one of the first selected for the new unit. He had been an imagery interpreter, an expert in the analysis of overhead reconnaissance photographs. But perhaps Riley's best qualification for the job was that he had a history of psychic experiences, like many others who joined the unit.
The people involved in the unit came from a lot of different disciplines within the intelligence field. Some were intelligence agents, case officers, things of that nature. And quite often, many of them had very interesting backgrounds. Several had near-death experiences. One was, of course, in Vietnam, having been shot up. At least one or several of the people have recounted an early experience sometime in their life with what they believe to be a UFO.
So it wasn't your average bunch of soldiers?
Well, yes and no.
By 1983, the Army had begun to expand its recruitment for the unit, after Ingo Swann developed a special remote viewing technique. The new technique, he claimed, could make anyone as good as the best natural psychic. One of the first selected for this alluring new training program was an officer named Ed Dames.
Ingo Swann, as my mentor, was one of the most difficult, the toughest teachers I've ever had. What he was asking us to do was almost unbelievable. He was a disciplinarian. There were absolutely no errors allowed in the performance of our training duties. He cracked the whip constantly. It was a very, very stressful environment, more stressful than I had been in a lot of very strenuous Army training programs. In fact, I had become Ingo Swann's protege, the caretaker of the technology, if you will. And so I provided advanced training to the individuals in the team, my peer group.
You're the Luke Skywalker to his Obi-Wan Kenobi.
I suppose you could say that.
At SRI in California and Fort Meade in Maryland, America now had 2 operational psychic spying units. They enjoyed support at the highest levels of the intelligence community. For as one enthusiastic congressman put it, they were a low-cost radar system, and if the Russians had them, America should have them too.
Can you touch the top of the target with your hands?
Intelligence gathering is like putting together the pieces of a puzzle. Some pieces come from satellite imagery, some from electronic intercepts, some from the open media, some from human agents on the ground. To its supporters in the U.S. intelligence community, remote viewing was simply an inexpensive way of providing yet another piece of the puzzle.
Slowly around the edges there, and around the sides and the front and the back. The unit had been established in an attempt to gather intelligence against very intractable, high-level intelligence programs. For instance, problems that the Army had with predicting what Soviet tanks would appear on the next battlefield, things of that ilk, including strategic programs, nuclear weapons, biological weapons, chemical warfare weapons programs. It was a tactic of desperation. It was an attempt to go around doctrinal intelligence gathering because those techniques, those methods were not answering the mail, if you would.
Some viewers exhibited talents in certain areas, more so than others. One particular viewer was very good at people, locating them, describing them, actually describing their mental state and where they were coming from, what they were doing.
The times that we really employed this, again, to good stead were against individuals like Muammar Gaddafi, to determine during the Libyan war where he would move to next so that we could ascertain his position and drop bombs on him.
Another remote viewer I recall was very, very good at detecting anything nuclear. Anything that was involving nuclear material to him had a green glow around it. And in fact, I found that to be true because I could also detect a green, like kryptonite, I guess, a kryptonite green light glow on fissionable nuclear material.
Unfortunately, the official documents which could corroborate these claims are classified, and the remote viewers say that for security reasons, they themselves were often not told how accurate they had been. But I was able to get some idea of the accuracy of remote viewing under conditions like those of actual operations at Fort Meade.
Across.
In the old days of Ingo Swann's training program, remote viewers used map coordinates to start their sessions. But it was eventually found that random numbers worked just as well, or even no numbers at all. The idea seemed to be that at some deep level, the remote viewer knew what the assigned target was, without ever having been told. Things like map coordinates or random numbers were merely rituals. Here I have asked Mel Riley to remote view a target selected arbitrarily just before the session. All I have told him is that it is a location at some particular date. As far as he knows, it could be anywhere, at any time.
Dome-like.
Give me some textures.
Rough. Hard. Sandy. Dry. Arid.
Temperatures.
Dry. Dusty. Hot.
Sounds.
Is this rushing sound?
Okay, can you quickly give me some stage 4s? Some AIs and EIs.
EIs. Panic. Fear. Confusion. Dread. Spewing forth just roiling and rolling clouds of ash. Hot, choking.
The target was a nuclear test at Bikini Atoll in July of 1946.
Clouds of ash. Hot, choking. Panic, fear, confusion, dread.
Riley's session wasn't perfect. As often happens in remote viewing, he described some of the basic elements of the target accurately, but failed when it came to a broader description of what he was perceiving.
AOL break like a volcano.
Still, one has to remember that remote viewing is just one piece of the intelligence puzzle. If an analyst in Washington is expecting to find something at a target site, he may see it clearly in the remote viewer's data, even if the remote viewer himself doesn't see it. In this session, for example, the target is a particular missile silo at Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming. Riley thinks he is describing a skyscraper, but an analyst might notice instead the shape of an MX missile.
Most of our clients, our clientele in the Secret Service, the FBI, the CIA, DIA, Navy and Air Force, sometimes Drug Enforcement Agency, are return clients that would not have repeatedly come back to us. That's not to say that they acknowledged us to other people, but they would not have come back unless they were getting something that was useful. And in many cases, they did tell us that it was useful.
In all this talk about techniques and targets and clients in the intelligence community, it's easy to forget something. Remote viewers were not merely passive intelligence-gathering devices, like electronic radars or spy satellites. Remote viewers were human beings. The closer they got to their targets, the more they were there, immersed, senses and emotions bathed in a new and perhaps unsettling reality.
In one instance, we did a coordinate, and the place turned out to be what I call a prison camp. The buildings in it were like American barrack types of things, 2 stories. This wasn't in America, by the way. And it was surrounded, it was in a forest. There was forest cover everywhere. It was very hard to photograph from the spy in the sky, satellites and everything like that. It had 3 enormous wire fences with barbed wire patrolled by dogs. And but it had a railhead. It had a railway that came up to the front major building. And there was a road leading to it, and the road seemed to be equally protected on both sides for a considerable distance and so forth and so on. So we were sitting there, and I says, well, this is a prison camp. Why should they be interested in a prison camp, you know? And so, of course, my monitor, who I won't mention, said, well, look around and everything. There must be something there. So then I noticed that there was 2 big elevator doors in one of these buildings. So I says, well, they're not going up, so they must be going down. So I went down, and there was a whole different world. And it was an awful world, just dreadful. This was a biological research installation where they were subjecting monkeys and dogs and horses and pigs to extreme biological infectious diseases, and human beings too. And so the prison camp on top was probably a preserve of political undesirables who disappeared from and were used as human subjects. And this is the only, it still makes me cry when I recall that. I was a wreck after this. This was just the most dreadful thing I'd ever seen. And I think I wept for at least an hour before I could get it back together and things like that. So my conclusion, I shouldn't probably talk about that site. I can't identify the country. I do know that the place was identified as that, and that it was totally destroyed a couple years hence.
The realization of the eurekas, the oh my gods that one experienced, one realizes that this was a doable thing, that remote viewing really worked and could produce accurate information, accurate enough to be used in cases of deadly force or life or death situations, was profound. And it was life-changing. One would never be the same after they came out of that training. We would never be able to relate to the world around us, to time and space, the same again. And so the implications were quite profound. And we were also not able to relate to our fellow military officers the same way that we did before. So we'd walk down the halls of the Pentagon and hear Twilight Zone theme songs when we walked by, do-do-do-do-do-do, that kind of thing.